Today I'm here to talk to you about grain-free ingredients, and that's something we do in our business, but also something we observe and track and watch in the market. Some of this may be review, some of it may be new information, so feel free to chime in, ask questions as we go, and do not film anything. Just kidding. So when we start here, we want to think about Stephen Covey, and he always said begin with the end in mind, and that was thinking about your funeral. And at your funeral, what are you going to be thinking? You won't be thinking, but what do you want people to remember you by? And that's not the point here. The point is, what do we want to cover in this presentation that you'll get out of it? And so some key takeaways and objectives that I want to start with, really it starts with creating some healthy industry dialogue and amongst you, amongst suppliers, amongst producers, to talk about what's going on and what the future might hold. Also understanding you can't control the market. I think we all know that, but sometimes it helps just to say it. And looking at the things you can control, where those are and what opportunities you can to leverage the information and knowledge you have. And the last thing is just understanding the value of knowledge and information. And the umbrella there is to kind of under the umbrella of grain-free ingredients. So this is me. Basically, my background is in operations mostly, and then most recently at Lansing in the marketing side of things. So I've worked in fertilizer, I've worked in food plants, I've worked in pots and plans. So I've done a lot of different things in my career, and I've been with Lansing about 10 years. I run the pet food ingredients division, and we're out of Perrysburg, Ohio. Our headquarters are here in Overland Park, Kansas. And primarily, our business serves grain-free ingredients to pet food manufacturers. Lansing as a company actually used to be Lansing Grain. So we supply a lot of grain and other feed ingredients to various consumers of that. We are headquartered in Overland Park, Kansas, and we transport about 38.1, maybe it's 0.2, but anyway, million metric tons of grains, feed ingredients, and other energy products. Those other energy products are everything from crude oil, biodiesel, frac sand, the whole shoot and match. We operate about 20 different facilities with storage capacity of about 1.9 million metric tons. So a little bit about the division that I operate, and we've got a nice group of folks in Perrysburg. We also have some people here in Overland Park that operate that. We primarily focus on sweet potatoes, peas, carrots, lentils, garbanzo beans. We do some custom blends, and then also some other specialty ingredients. So now that I bored you with the marketing side, we'll get to what you came here for. Lastly, I want to mention, it's important, we supply more corn than all these other ingredients combined to the pet food industry. So the purpose of today, make sure and keep my corn guys happy, is really to talk about grain-free, understand it, and not necessarily to say one's better than the other is not the other. So just talking that through. So an overview of today, no pain, no grain. We're talking about the evolution of where we started and where we're going into the future. Talk a little bit about marketing and procurement and how that's changed over the last decade. Also want to see what's on deck. And then the last thing is a call to action. And are you coming to the party? And if you are, what does that look like? What do you need to do before you get there? So if we step back and we way back and say, okay, grain-free defined, what does that look like? It's the elimination of all grains, wheat, rice, corn, barley, oats. And you might ask the question, why grain-free? And if you go back to why, well, it's following a lot of the human trends, that's part of it. And then also has to do with allergies, skin condition, digestibility, and whatnot. There's also a piece there, if you read between the lines, it has a lot to do with marketing too. So when you step back and you take the grain out, what are you going to put in? So you have to come up with some sort of a carbohydrate alternative. And that's where the grain-free ingredients come from. So alternate grains and pet food formulations, you can see how this breakdown, that's a statistic from Watt, and they're saying that most grain-free pet foods, about 50% have peas in them, and then that's followed by chickpeas and lentils and sweet potatoes. What I did find interesting though in their statistic is there's no potatoes in there. So my personal opinion is they forgot about them. They're probably somewhere around 32.756%. It's just an estimate. So grain-free market and demand trends. If you look at this market, it's really grown a lot. We all know that from being in the industry. You know, you're talking about less than $1 billion just 6 short years ago, and we're knocking on the door of $4 billion in sales. So 300% growth, about a 54% overlap in natural. So if you take that total natural category, the numbers we're hearing, and it changes every day, is that 54% of that is grain-free. And certainly the changes in mass and retail are continuing to see more demand in grain-free. How much more demand? I think only time will tell. So it started with a flake. And really that's where potato flakes came from. And it's interesting to note that most of the pet food potato 10 years ago came out of flaking operations that were making Idaho potato flakes and things of that nature. And before pet food came along, those were all going into dairy and cattle feed. So almost a byproduct that wanted to be gotten rid of. So what happened is it started to be some demand for pet food, and that demand outstripped the supply. So the flakes, there weren't enough flakes out there. So sweet potatoes and tapioca and other root starches started to come into the market. And we'll go into that a little bit more later, but it's interesting how that evolution of a byproduct became a product that was actually focused and produced. Another interesting slide here is you say potato, I say potato. And I've never seen one ingredient with so many different names. And it's everything from potato pellets to low leach potato to potato mix to mechanically dried to solar dried to potato meal to whole ground potato. It sounds like you're an auctioneer. But it truly is. All these exist out there. And at the end of the day, the nutritional profile of every single one of those is pretty doggone similar. You might see a little more protein or a little less. But the truth be told, they're all about the same thing. They're all dried potatoes for pet food. But it's important to note that's how this economics of this industry really got back on its feet, because there just wasn't enough potato to supply. So that's had to pull from a lot of different directions. This is a really interesting slide, and this is data that we put together. I can't guarantee it's perfect, but this is potato production for pet food 5 years ago. You can see there's some coming in from Europe, a little bit in Canada. Idaho's a big producer. Not a whole lot of dots. The next slide really is interesting when you jump ahead. This is 5 years later. It's almost like the ethanol industry all over again. There really wasn't any dedicated potato manufacturing for pet food in existence 10 years ago. This is the growth we've seen. And there's continued growth. But this is simply an economic story. There was demand, there wasn't supply, and the supply basically came into the market. And it's global. There's Indian potato coming in, there's European potato. It's very interesting. Good economic case study. So this is our plant, and I just want to show you, I've got the Unwrapped logo out there. It's about a 1-minute video just to give you a sense of what it looks like inside sweet potato drying facility. But this is our sweet potato facility in Goldsboro, North Carolina. There you go. Those are your raw sweet potatoes. Come through a packing shed, and then anything that doesn't meet the spec would come into our operation. That's our crew down in North Carolina. Just a little video clip. Two massive pizza ovens. So that just did a little bit of what it looks like inside of a sweet potato dryer. They're all very similar. Could have a little bit of different input process, but you're basically taking raw product that may not meet food grade and you're putting it through a process to dry it, whether that's a hammer mill or a dicer, a vertical dryer, some type of an oven belt dryer, or a rotary dryer. But essentially, we talked about potatoes, we talked about sweet potatoes, and then there's also the pulse piece, which comes into play here, and that's the peas, the lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes. And that's a big part of the grain-free ingredient mix as well. If you look at total production globally, most of the pulse production of those three are peas. Most of that's about 20% Canada. Quite a few different countries produce peas. Second would be chickpeas. Third would be lentils, and between Canada and India, it's about 70% of the total production. Interesting pie chart there. People don't normally think about those three ingredients. The one that surprises me is when I think about chickpeas. That's a pretty big number for total production. It's a lot of hummus. Sustainability of supply is one of the key pieces when you start to think about grain-free ingredients, and we'll get to that later as far as the total production of each food crop, and you'll see where they fall in that lineup, and that's why it's so important to consider this element. But you really want to think about the ingredient as it pertains to the subject of food grade supply and the market dynamics there. Your pet grade product doesn't always follow the food grade pricing channels. What's an interesting statement is farmers don't grow feed grade crops. Farmers grow chickpeas for food. Farmers grow lentils for food. Feed grade is just where they have to go when they can't sell it into the food grade market. So what that means is that if there's a high yield, that doesn't necessarily mean low prices for feed grade. High yield could mean lots of food grade available. Another piece of the puzzle is quality does not equal price. You could have a really poor crop year and think, man, feed grade is going to be cheap. But if the yield was low, there may be more sub-quality product going into the food market, which makes the feed market not as available. What that does is it makes it very difficult to predict and understand values in these markets because they're a function of food grade, but they're also a function of yield, they're a function of quality, so it's multifaceted. The last piece is there is some truth to the feed grade being a function of the food grade overall. That's probably the biggest driver, but you have to understand the ins and the outs and the global supply, and does India have a tariff, and what's going on with Canadian production and whatnot. So that's something we keep an eye on. We think it's very important to understand on a forward market curve. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. As I mentioned, there's also an increased amount of capacity in terms of pet-only production, particularly potatoes, sweet potatoes, things of that nature. You also have to look at global production, as I mentioned, versus regional demand, where it's coming from, what the freight spreads are, things of that nature. And then untapped capacity expansion. And when I say staples, I don't mean we're going to feed dogs staples. I mean staple crops. And we'll talk about that in a moment also, is what are the staple food crops? It's not avocados, it's not kiwi. You've got to look at something that actually has some depth and supply if you're going to consider that for one of your formulas. And that's why not carrots? Why not green beans? Well, carrots and green beans, if you look at the average plate of food, at the average table around the world, those aren't on the plate every day. Rice, potatoes, things like that, those are more of a common staple crop. So when you think about marketing and formulation, you got to think of how does that equate to income. So there's a lot of value engineering going on now. Now that there's changes in sustainability and overuse of certain ingredients, formulators are looking at that and saying, where can we change a diet a little bit? Maybe reduce this ingredient, increase this ingredient. And the best part about this is dogs don't talk. So you can do that and usually no one notices. And it's important because if you're going to maintain a product that can grow in terms of total supply, you've got to have flexibility. So formulation optimization is a key piece of the puzzle. Also selective ingredients and where that's going to go on the label. And how that plays into the sequence of meat first, and do you have two different potato ingredients in the diet, and are they separately listed or together? There's a lot of adjectives used more and more and more as identity preservation, Yukon Gold potatoes from North Dakota, things like that. Covington sweet potatoes from Wayne County, and those kind of things that marketing groups are finding that sells well. Challenging other side of that, though, is when you narrow it down to that specific of a product, to that specific of a region, you are limiting your supply options. So there's a flood in Wayne County, you might have a problem next year. Tan staffel, does anybody know what that means? Do I have any hands? No one knows. It means there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And what that means is, if you think about this industry, everything's free. Grain-free, pumpkin-free, GMO-free, gluten-free, chicken-free. It's unbelievable the amount of free diets out there. And what's really ironic is that this time in our industry, pet food costs more than it's ever cost before, but everybody's saying it's free. LLID, limited ingredients. And what that means is when you have a diet that's a limited ingredient, it has one or two core items in the formula. And by limited ingredient, I mean is when you decide what that limited formula is, you better make sure that if you've got 3 key ingredients, that there's some depth and sustainability in those. Because the last thing you want to do is come up with quail egg formula and there's not enough quail eggs to supply your demand. So you have to look at economic risk. You got to look at sustainability. And sometimes that it's just not economically friendly. It's look, hey, this would really market well, but it doesn't make sense because we can't get the supply long term. So that creates a lot of inflexibility to adjust your formulas. There's risk exposure to that. I mean, you have basically all your peas in one pod, pardon the pun. You've also got to look at, offset. What's the marketing versus a consumer value versus how far is this going to go versus is my competition going to copy me and then it's really going to cause a problem. So when I talk about high inclusion, I always think about high inclusion versus pixie dust. And here we have Tinkerbell, who would add some pixie dust. But the impact on overall demand, limited ingredients, they move the needle. If you've got a diet that's 30% chickpeas, that's going to move the needle on supply and demand. Tinkerbell doesn't move the needle. If it's way down the label and you use 3% avocados, it's probably not going to really impact supply and demand. So it really comes down to formulas and economics. And I have here a picture is worth $1,000 because a picture of a blueberry on the front of the bag is worth $1,000. It doesn't mean you're going to have that many blueberries in it. So here we're going to talk a little bit about grain-free economics and how this all played out. This is a really interesting chart. Half this data is made up, but you'll find it interesting anyway. Potatoes and corn, if you compare the two, basically grain-free versus grain, and you go down the list here of different attributes, it really comes down to what's your cost? Cost per bushel, cost per pound. And when you compare the two, and you look at the protein content, and you do the math on that, wow, the potato protein is $5 a pound in this formula versus corn protein is 60 cents a pound. So how are you going to offset that? How do you make these grain-free diets economically feasible? And that's where some of the value engineering comes in. So you take another example, let's look at potatoes and peas. Now peas aren't as cheap as corn, but they've got a higher protein percent, 20% protein, a lower cost per pound, so your cost of protein's 75 cents. A little closer to corn, but certainly not as high as potato. I'm not saying potato you don't want in your diet, it's just something to consider where you're going to get your protein source, and we'll cover that as well. So Paul's formulation considerations, other things to think about is you got to think about when you're replacing the meat, you're probably going to have some cost savings, but you better make sure you're balancing your nutritionals, you understand the high pulse inclusion rates, how does that affect your amino acid levels, and are they being met? And I am not a nutritionist, so don't ask me. And the other piece is adjusting grain-free ingredient inputs. So when you adjust those inputs, you probably want to balance that out. If you've got in a diet that's not limited ingredient, keep a couple of those items on there just in case the market moves. It gives you some flexibility in your future formulations. So there's a lot going on in vegetable proteins, and it's not just peas, it's overall vegetable proteins coming from all different varieties, and a lot of increase in the food demand, a lot of increase in vegan diets, and there's extremely expanded global trade activity. Wet fractionation, dry fractionation, dealing with the byproducts that come out of these plants. If you think about that from a total vegetable protein, there's a tremendous amount of increased investment globally, a tremendous amount of investment in North America, in China, and around the world. And what's happened is there's the amount of peas that are exported from Canada shipped to China for protein extraction is off the charts. And as we all know, we've seen the press releases, there's hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in fractionation capacity in Canada, North America. So how that all plays out, we don't really know. But I do think there's some opportunities in being able to handle both of the protein and the starch output, because the different fractionation process produces different levels of protein on the isolate and the starch. It's noteworthy to say China and India, what they do here is going to move the needle. And with trade tensions and everything else going on, we think that's probably going to increase some of the demand, but it's going to even have more of an increase on the logistics. It's not a matter of the demand going away, it's just how's it going to get there. So some of the procurement strategies we've seen in this market really become interesting over the years is the big guys are getting bigger. So when you have large multinational companies buying smaller companies and consolidating, there's going to be more and more direct buying. And that also goes for co-manufacturing. Buyers are going to want to consolidate all their, say, chickpea purchases into one contract. They don't want to share that volume with someone else that's going through the co-man that gets to pick up on the total volume spend. So there's more and more silo approach to these purchasing activities. And there's also, reality is producers and marketing, you got to add value. If you don't have a better mousetrap and all you are is buying and selling, it's just not sustainable. There's a lot more production contracting of specialty crops to making sure they're available. Everybody in this room probably knows in the last 24 months, chickpea values have started with a 2, and they've gone up to an 8, and they've gone down to a 6. And when you have that in your diet, it makes life difficult. So long-term offtake agreements are another way to look at things. Trying to find ways to hedge against volatile pricing that's really not hedgeable in any other market. And then lastly, collective buying power. We're seeing some of the smaller producers, the smaller co-manufacturers, bring their volume together and go to the market with that to try to, compete with the big guys. So what's on deck? This is the question. Everybody's saying, what's the next big thing going to be? What's going to happen next? You have to look at what works. The overall ingredient input costs have to be balanced. The protein value versus the source has to be balanced, and there's got to be some level of sustainability. So is there one next ingredient? I don't know the answer to that. I think that the grain-free market is here to stay. I think one area that is going to be interesting, if you look at beans and legumes, and I'll explain why here, that may be a place that you see some demand in the future. There's already been a little bit in fava beans and some things like that. I think there needs to be some studies on how much gas it produces in a dog, quite frankly. No joke. But if you look at that and you say, okay, staple numbers, some staple crops that you can look at and say, where does it all fall out in global production? And this is an interesting slide. Corn, wheat, rice, obviously, big production. Then you start to go down the line, you say, okay, well, potatoes, yeah, they're up there, tapioca, sweet potatoes. Dry beans. Dry beans fall in between peas, chickpeas, and lentils. There's a possibility there that beans could be something in future formulations. They've got great proteins, they've got good fiber. I don't know the answer to that, but I think there's starting to be some interest in that. Beyond that, I don't know that there's any one item that's a staple crop that's grain-free that's going to go into these diets. There could be, but I don't know the answer to that. So why is the staying power? Why do I think that the grain-free ingredient market's here to stay? Well, first of all, I think if you look at a dog's life, the average dog lives 12 years. And we've been in this about 10 years. So a lot of these dogs, they're still around. Their pet owners are still feeding them grain-free diets. So the question is, will there be consumer loyalty? When they get the next dog or the next cat, are they going to feed it the same diet? And I think it's likely. I think the reason is because they've had a good experience with what they fed their first dog or cat, and they'll probably stick with it. The other piece is it's more and more available in the mass market. So it's easier to get. It's online and it's at the grocery store. And the human trends are supporting this. So those are some of the reasons we think there's logic in the staying power. And the last slide, have a little fun with this, is how do you have fun at the pet food party? And that doesn't mean at the reception. That means if you're in the industry, how do you, and you're an ingredient supplier in particular, how do you have fun? And by having fun, how do you find success? So I'll give you some points. Number one, you better make sure you get an invite. And if you don't get an invite, you got to invite yourself. Number two, don't show up late. Don't come to the party with the next great grain-free ingredient that's already been a great grain-free ingredient. It's a little late for that. Another piece is be nice to the host, right? If you show up, make sure you respect them, listen to them, hear what they have to say. That's why God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Next piece is arrive with something nobody else brought. Don't bring Aunt Gertrude's bean dip. Everybody brings that every year. Bring something else. Bring a different ingredient. Bring something new. Bring something that's going to add flair and excitement, and it's a novel item, but it's got to be sustainable. Don't think you're the smartest person in the room, even if you are. Bring your swimsuit. Could be a pool party, but don't dive in head first. because a lot of times the pool depth is not deep enough. I know firsthand, and there's plenty of people in this room, you see this great opportunity and you dive right in and you find out the depth is not there. And it hurts. Can leave a mark. When you're there, get a phone number, talk to some people, and make sure you get a date. So follow up, circle back, go see them.